Honestly, my mother was suffocating. She should be thanking me for finally making her the lead story.
Miss Valle, that is enough! Your lack of remorse is absolutely repulsiveness. For the calculated murder of Shannon Valle, this court hereby sentences you to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
On June 8, 2023, the tranquil neighborhood of Westlake Hills in Austin, Texas, was shattered by the discovery of Shannon Valle's brutally beaten body in her home. The 59-year-old former news director of KTXN, a major network affiliate in Austin, lay sprawled across her living room floor, surrounded by scattered paperwork, her laptop still open on the coffee table, and a shattered crystal paperweight, later identified as the murder weapon, covered in blood and hair. Multiple blunt force trauma wounds to her head and defensive wounds on her arms indicated a frenzied personal attack rather than a calculated killing. What investigators would soon discover about this crime would rock the local media community and expose the dark underbelly of ambition, deception, and toxic family dynamics hidden behind the glossy veneer of television fame. The victim's phone was found several feet from her body, and when detectives examined it, they discovered a text message sent 3 days before the murder to her daughter, Sarah Valle, a well-known evening news anchor at KTXA, a competing Austin station. The message read, "I'm done protecting your image. Time for everyone to see the real you. Meet me tomorrow, 7 p.m. No cameras." This cryptic message would soon take on sinister significance as investigators dug deeper into the relationship between mother and daughter. Shannon's home security system had captured something crucial. At precisely 3:22 a.m., the Ring doorbell camera recorded a 3-second clip of a figure approaching the front door, wearing what appeared to be a distinctive emerald green trench coat, a fleeting image that would later become central to the prosecution's case. If you're watching this true crime documentary, please like the video, subscribe to our channel, and share in the comments where you're watching from. We love connecting with true crime enthusiasts from around the world. Now, back to the shocking case of Shannon Valle's murder, where the first responding officers noted something unusual about the crime scene. Despite signs of a violent struggle, certain items seemed deliberately arranged, as if someone had attempted to stage the scene after the initial chaos of the attack. When police arrived at Shannon's home that morning, it was Sarah Valle herself who had reported finding her mother's body, claiming she had stopped by after her morning run when her mother failed to answer phone calls. Sarah, age 34, displayed what the first officers on scene described as unusual composure, her hair perfectly styled, makeup immaculate, wearing designer athleisure wear that seemed incongruously pristine for someone who had supposedly just discovered her mother's bloodied corpse. Detective David Anderson of the Austin Police Department's Homicide Unit noted in his initial report that Sarah seemed more concerned with how she appeared to the officers than with her mother's violent death, repeatedly checking her reflection in her phone camera and asking if media were outside before answering any questions about the crime scene. The neighborhood canvass revealed that Shannon Valle had been well-liked, if somewhat reserved, known primarily for her former high-profile position in Austin's television industry. Several neighbors reported hearing what might have been an argument around 3 a.m., though none had thought to call the police at the time, assuming it was just a television playing too loudly. Shannon's home office showed signs of having been searched, with files out of place and several folders missing entirely from a clearly labeled filing system. The medical examiner would later determine that Shannon had been dead for approximately 12 hours before Sarah reported finding the body, placing the time of death around 3:15 to 3:30 a.m., precisely when the Ring camera had captured the mysterious figure in the emerald green coat. As crime scene investigators processed the house, they found something odd. Despite the violence of the attack, there were no signs of forced entry, suggesting Shannon had either known her attacker or the killer had a key. Blood spatter analysis indicated the attack had begun near the home office doorway and continued into the living room where Shannon had apparently tried to escape her assailant. Detective Anderson requested immediate access to Shannon's financial records, emails, and recent communications when he spotted bank statements among the scattered papers, several with apparent signature discrepancies highlighted in yellow marker. The name on those documents was Sarah Vale, Shannon's daughter, the same woman who had reported finding the body with dry eyes and perfect mascara. Shannon Vale had lived alone since her divorce from Sarah's father 15 years earlier and maintained what appeared to be a comfortable lifestyle from her retirement package and investments. However, bank records would later show numerous unexplained withdrawals over the previous 18 months, totaling more than $180,000, a significant portion of her retirement savings. A sticky note attached to one statement read, "Confronted Sarah, denied everything, check signature in Shannon's handwriting." These financial discrepancies would become the first thread investigators would pull, gradually unraveling a complex web of deception that had bound mother and daughter in an increasingly toxic relationship. By evening on that first day, detectives had obtained a preliminary warrant to access Shannon's email accounts, where they discovered a message drafted to KTXA's station manager just 3 days before the murder. The unsent email detailed accusations that Sarah had been forging Shannon's signature on financial documents and running a secret OnlyFans account where she leveraged her news anchor persona to sell exclusive content to subscribers. The draft concluded with a threat. "If Sarah doesn't come clean about everything by the end of the week, I'll have no choice but to bring this to your attention officially, along with evidence of her illegal financial activities." This unsent email, alongside the text message demanding a meeting without cameras, suggested Shannon had been preparing to confront her daughter about serious allegations that could potentially destroy Sarah's carefully cultivated public image and career. As day turned to evening in Austin, Detective Anderson called for surveillance on Sarah Vale while his team continued processing evidence from Shannon's home. Sarah had returned to her downtown luxury apartment after giving her initial statement, where she was observed by plainclothes officers ordering takeout, accepting a package from a high-end clothing retailer, and posting a somber-looking selfie on Instagram with the caption, "Heartbroken beyond words," taking time to process this unimaginable loss. The disconnect between her public display of grief and her observed behavior raised immediate red flags for investigators. Meanwhile, forensics teams had lifted several partial fingerprints from the murder weapon and discovered small fragments of green fabric caught on the jagged edges of Shannon's broken watch. The timepiece had stopped at 3:24 a.m., further narrowing the time of death. Detective David Anderson arrived at the Austin Police Department's downtown headquarters early the morning after Shannon Vale's murder, his mind already cataloging the peculiar behavior of Sarah Vale at the crime scene. The 17-year veteran of homicide investigations had developed a finely tuned sense for detecting performative grief, and Sarah's composure had struck him as theatrical rather than authentic, too controlled, too aware of how she appeared to others, even in what should have been a moment of devastating shock. He immediately assigned officers to pull Shannon's financial records, phone logs, emails, and social media accounts, while focusing his personal attention on the distinctive emerald green trench coat captured in the ring footage. Such a specific and unusual garment could be the key to connecting a suspect to the scene, and Anderson had a nagging suspicion about where he might have seen such a coat before. "Run background on both Shannon and Sarah Vale," Anderson instructed his partner, Detective Melissa Chen, as they settled into their shared office with coffee. "I want to know everything: family dynamics, career histories, financial situations, romantic entanglements, the works." Anderson's instincts had already locked onto Sarah as a person of interest, not just because family members are always the first suspects, but because of her strange affect at the crime scene. Chen nodded and began typing, pulling up Sarah Vala's social media profiles first, revealing a carefully curated online presence filled with behind-the-scenes news studio shots, fitness poses, and promotional content for local Austin businesses. "Look at this," Chen said suddenly, turning her screen toward Anderson to show an Instagram post from 3 weeks earlier. Sarah Vale posing in the KTXA studio wearing an eye-catching emerald green trench coat with distinctive gold buttons captioned "Spring Fashion," even when the teleprompter brings stormy news, anchor style. The discovery sent a jolt of adrenaline through Anderson, who immediately dispatched officers to obtain security footage from Sarah's apartment building for the night of the murder. If Sarah had left her building wearing that coat in the early morning hours and returned later, they would have their first solid piece of evidence connecting her to the crime scene. Meanwhile, the forensics team called with preliminary findings. The blood under Shannon Vale's fingernails contained not only her own DNA, but also that of another individual, suggesting she had scratched her attacker during the struggle. Additionally, fibers found clutched in the victim's hand appeared to be consistent with high-end wool and silk blend fabric, commonly used in designer outerwear. By mid-afternoon, the financial records Anderson had requested painted a troubling picture. Despite Sarah Vala's local anchor salary of approximately $87,000 annually, she maintained a lifestyle far beyond those means. She lived in a downtown luxury apartment, renting for $4,500 monthly, drove a leased Mercedes-Benz GLE coupe, and credit card statements showed regular charges at high-end restaurants, designer boutiques, and exclusive medical spas throughout Austin and neighboring cities. Most tellingly, bank records revealed that Sarah had less than $3,000 in savings, despite her seemingly lavish lifestyle, and her credit cards were nearly maxed out with over $64,000 in combined debt. "She's living way beyond her means," Anderson murmured, "and now we need to find out if her mother was bankrolling this lifestyle, willingly or otherwise." The tech team analyzing Shannon Vale's laptop discovered something significant, a hidden folder containing screenshots of bank statements with signature comparisons highlighted, showing what appeared to be Shannon's authentic signature alongside clearly forged versions on withdrawal forms and checks. A spreadsheet meticulously documented unauthorized withdrawals totaling $187,432 over an 18-month period, all from Shannon's retirement accounts. She was building a case, Anderson said, as he reviewed the files, not just notes to herself, but organized evidence as if she was preparing for legal action. This discovery aligned with a draft email found on Shannon's laptop to her attorney, never sent, inquiring about the process for reporting financial fraud by a family member while minimizing public exposure and potential criminal charges. Anderson's team also uncovered Shannon Vale's professional history. She had been a powerful figure in Austin television for over 2 decades, serving as news director at KTXN until her retirement 5 years earlier. Former colleagues described Shannon as brilliant but controlling, with exacting standards and a reputation for making or breaking careers in the local market. Sarah had started in television at just 17 under her mother's direct supervision, and Shannon had micromanaged every aspect of her daughter's career development, from diction coaching to wardrobe selection to strategic job placements. "Classic stage mom turned news director," remarked one former colleague. "She created Sarah from scratch, controlled every move, and I always wondered what would happen when Sarah got too old for the ingenue anchor role Shannon had crafted for her." While Anderson pieced together the professional dynamic between mother and daughter, Detective Chen made another significant discovery. Shannon Vale had recently changed her life insurance policy increasing the death benefit to $2.3 million with Sarah as the sole beneficiary. The policy change had been made approximately 8 months earlier, around the time the unauthorized withdrawals from Shannon's accounts had accelerated. Additionally, Shannon's will had been updated just 2 months before her death, with a curious addition, a clause specifying that if Shannon died under suspicious circumstances, an independent financial audit should be conducted of all her accounts before any assets were distributed. She suspected something, Chen said, pointing to the clause. She knew she might be in danger, but instead of going to the police, she tried to create posthumous accountability. That evening, Anderson received the security footage from Sarah Valle's apartment building, showing clear images of Sarah leaving at 2:47 a.m. on the night of the murder, wearing what appeared to be the distinctive emerald green trench coat, her face partially obscured by a baseball cap but still recognizable. The footage then showed her returning at 4:05 a.m., no longer wearing the coat but instead carrying a gym bag that hadn't been present when she left. This timeline aligned perfectly with Shannon's estimated time of death and the Ring camera footage, providing the first concrete evidence placing Sarah at or near the crime scene during the critical window. Anderson immediately applied for a search warrant for Sarah's apartment, specifically looking for the emerald green trench coat, any items that might have been transported in the gym bag, and access to her electronic devices. As they prepared to execute the search warrant the following morning, the forensics team made another breakthrough. Shannon's home security system included not just the Ring doorbell but also interior cameras that had been disabled at 3:20 a.m. the night of the murder. However, the system had backed up to cloud storage until the moment of deactivation, capturing a partial image of someone entering the home using a key. Though the face wasn't visible, the distinctive emerald green sleeve of a coat was clearly identifiable in the frame. She knew about the Ring camera, Anderson theorized, but either didn't know about or forgot the interior system. This technical oversight would prove crucial in establishing both premeditation and Sarah's presence inside the home. Before approaching Sarah for formal questioning, Anderson needed one more piece of evidence, proof that Sarah had worn that same emerald coat publicly in the hours after her mother's murder, as he vaguely recalled seeing. The team reached out to KTXA and obtained broadcasts from June 8th, the day Shannon's body was discovered. There, in high-definition clarity, was Sarah Valle anchoring the evening news, wearing the identical emerald green trench coat captured on the Ring camera, discussing a local charity event with her signature camera-ready smile, mere hours after allegedly discovering her mother's battered body. That's either ice-cold calculation or profound psychological compartmentalization, Anderson remarked as they watched the footage. Either way, she's wearing evidence of her crime on broadcast television. Anderson decided it was time to bring Sarah Valle in for formal questioning, but instead of alerting her through standard channels, he chose a more strategic approach. He instructed a uniformed officer to visit KTXA during Sarah's evening broadcast preparation, asking her to come to the station the following morning to review some footage that might help identify a person of interest in her mother's case. This approach served a dual purpose. It prevented Sarah from having time to dispose of evidence before they executed the search warrant early the next morning, and it framed the interview as routine follow-up rather than an interrogation of a suspect, potentially catching her off guard. Tomorrow, Anderson told his team as they gathered their evidence files, we find out just how good an actress Sarah Valle really is. As dawn broke over Austin on June 10th, Detective Anderson led a team of 6 officers to execute the search warrant at Sarah Valle's downtown luxury apartment. They arrived at 6:15 a.m., timing the operation to catch Sarah before she left for either the police station appointment or her job at KTXA. When Sarah answered the door in silk pajamas and a full face of makeup, unusual for someone just waking up, Anderson noted her momentary flash of panic before she quickly composed herself into what he recognized as her on-air persona. "Ms. Valle, we have a warrant to search your apartment as part of the investigation into your mother's death," Anderson stated formally, handing her the document. Sarah's response was immediate and practiced. "Of course, Detective. Anything to help find who did this to my mother," she said with the perfect intonation of cooperative grief. Though Anderson observed she displayed no physical signs of distress, no reddened eyes, no tissue in hand, none of the typical markers of recent mourning. The search team methodically moved through Sarah's immaculately decorated apartment, photographing everything before touching it, taking particular note of a walk-in closet larger than some studio apartments filled with designer clothing organized by color and season. Detective Chen focused on this closet, searching specifically for the emerald green trench coat they'd seen in both the Ring footage and Sarah's broadcast. After nearly 20 minutes of careful examination, Chen called Anderson over. The coat was nowhere to be found among Sarah's meticulously organized wardrobe, despite numerous other high-end coats and jackets being present. This absence was their first significant finding. If Sarah had innocently worn the coat for her broadcast, there would be no reason for it to be missing now. While the search continued, Sarah sat perched on a white leather sofa, scrolling through her phone with apparent disinterest in the officers dismantling her carefully curated life. Anderson noticed she seemed particularly unconcerned until officers began examining her laptop and phone records, at which point she shifted slightly, crossing and uncrossing her legs several times. The first crack in her composed facade. Digital forensic specialists began the process of cloning her devices for later analysis, explaining they were looking for communications between her and her mother in the days leading up to the murder. Sarah nodded agreeably, but asked if she could freshen up before their scheduled interview at the station, a request Anderson granted while assigning a female officer to accompany her to the bathroom, standard procedure to prevent evidence destruction. In the apartment's second bedroom, converted to a home office and a recording space, officers discovered something unexpected: professional audio equipment, including high-end microphones, soundproofing panels, and editing software, a setup far more sophisticated than what would typically be needed for remote news broadcasts. A half-written script found on the desk contained what appeared to be episode notes for a podcast titled Misunderstood Women Who Break, with an outlined episode about a fictional news anchor falsely accused of murdering her controlling mother. The date on the document was June 2nd, 6 days before Shannon Valle's murder, suggesting either an eerie coincidence or, more disturbingly, a narrative Sarah had been developing before the crime was committed. The bathroom search yielded another significant discovery. Hidden in a false bottom of a decorative storage box were multiple prescription bottles for plastic surgery recovery medications dated over the previous 2 years, along with before and after photos of what appeared to be rhinoplasty, liposuction, and cheek implant procedures. The prescriptions came from 3 different cosmetic surgery centers in Houston, Dallas, and New Orleans, with the most recent dated just 3 weeks earlier. The combined cost of these procedures, based on receipts found with the photos, exceeded $113,000, far more than Sarah could afford on her salary, supporting the theory that she had been stealing from her mother to fund these secret surgeries. Perhaps the most damning discovery came from Sarah's bedroom closet, where officers found a gym bag, matching the one seen in the apartment security footage, hastily shoved behind designer shoeboxes. Inside the bag was a plastic grocery store bag containing a silk scarf with what appeared to be dried bloodstains. This item was immediately secured for DNA testing, with officers speculating it might have been used to handle the murder weapon without leaving fingerprints. Also inside the gym bag was a set of keys that, when later tested, perfectly matched the locks at Shannon Valle's home, confirming Sarah had unrestricted access to the murder scene. While Sarah prepared for the interview under supervision, Detective Anderson received a call from officers analyzing Shannon Valley's home computer. They had recovered the deleted email drafted to the station manager at KTXA, detailing not only the financial fraud, but also providing the login information and evidence of Sarah's secret OnlyFans account, where she had been posting content under the username Anchor After Hours. This account, according to the recovered email, featured Sarah in various states of undress, sometimes wearing parts of her news anchor wardrobe in sexually suggestive scenarios, directly violating her contract with the news station and potentially destroying her professional reputation if discovered. The email showed Shannon had been planning to expose both the fraud and the secret account unless Sarah came clean and sought professional help. As the search concluded, officers cataloged several other items of interest: a recently purchased paper shredder with remnants of what appeared to be financial documents still in the collection bin, a hidden safe containing over $22,000 in cash, bundled with withdrawal slips from Shannon's accounts bearing forged signatures, and a notebook containing practice versions of Shannon's signature, getting progressively more accurate over multiple pages. Sarah, now dressed in a conservative navy blue dress and subtle makeup, court-appropriate attire rather than her typical on-air look, watched impassively as evidence bags were carried past her. "Are we still doing that interview at the station?" she asked Anderson, with a practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'd really like to get this cleared up so I can prepare for tonight's broadcast." The drive to police headquarters was silent, with Sarah staring out the window of the unmarked police car, occasionally checking her reflection in her compact mirror and reapplying lipstick. Anderson observed this behavior with interest. In his experience, innocent family members of murder victims rarely worried about their appearance during the investigative process, being too consumed by grief and shock. Detective Chen met them at the station, having transported the most critical evidence for immediate processing, and directed Sarah to interview room 3, which was equipped with comprehensive audio and video recording equipment. Before beginning the formal interview, Anderson consulted briefly with the district attorney's office, sharing the evidence recovered from the apartment search and confirming they had sufficient grounds to consider Sarah Valley the prime suspect in her mother's murder. The stage was now set for what would become one of the most revealing and disturbing interrogations in recent Austin criminal history. As Sarah Valley settled into the interview room chair, adjusting her posture to what Anderson recognized as her on-camera stance, he observed something chilling. She appeared to be suppressing a smile, as if anticipating a performance rather than an interrogation about her mother's violent death. "Let's begin by talking about your relationship with your mother," Anderson started, intentionally opening with a broad question to establish baseline behavior. Sarah launched into what sounded like a prepared statement about her close, loving relationship with Shannon, describing her mother as my biggest supporter and champion. As she spoke, Anderson noticed she used past tense naturally when referring to her mother, a small but telling detail, as innocent family members often struggle with this linguistic shift in the immediate aftermath of a sudden death. The interrogation room at Austin Police Department headquarters was deliberately designed to be uncomfortable, windowless, furnished only with a metal table bolted to the floor and 3 chairs, illuminated by harsh fluorescent lighting that cast unflattering shadows on everyone's faces. For Sarah Valley, accustomed to professional lighting designed to enhance her appearance, this environment represented the first challenge in what would become a 14-hour psychological battle. Detective David Anderson began the recorded interview at precisely 10:17 a.m., stating the date, time, and names of all present, himself, Detective Chen, and Sarah Valley, who sat with perfect posture in her navy blue dress, hands folded neatly on the table. Anderson started with standard background questions, establishing Sarah's relationship to the victim, her whereabouts on the night of the murder, and her reason for visiting her mother's house the following morning. "I was home alone all night," Sarah stated with confidence, maintaining direct eye contact with Anderson. "I went to bed around 10 p.m. after reviewing some scripts for the next day's broadcast, and I didn't leave until morning when Mom didn't answer my calls." This statement directly contradicted the security footage showing her leaving her apartment at 2:47 a.m. But Anderson didn't immediately challenge this discrepancy, instead allowing Sarah to establish her false alibi in detail. Sarah continued with a polished account of finding her mother's body, describing her shock and immediately calling 911, though she struggled when Anderson asked for specific emotional details about that moment. "I was devastated, of course," she said, after an uncharacteristic pause, her voice maintaining the same even tone she'd used throughout. "It was like time stopped. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I just went into automatic mode, I guess." 3 hours into the interrogation, Anderson shifted strategies, moving from open-ended questions to more specific challenges. "Sarah, we've reviewed the security footage from your apartment building," he said calmly, sliding a still image across the table showing her leaving at 2:47 a.m. in the emerald green trench coat. Sarah's composure wavered momentarily, a quick blink, a slight tightening around her mouth, before she recovered. "Oh, that," she said with a dismissive wave. "I forgot about that. I couldn't sleep and went for a quick drive to clear my head. I do that sometimes when I'm stressed about work." This new narrative contradicted her earlier categorical statement about not leaving her apartment, and Anderson noted this discrepancy in his pad before continuing. "And the green coat you're wearing in this image, where is that coat now?" he asked, maintaining a conversational tone. Sarah's response came too quickly. "I donated it last week to a women's shelter." At the 4-hour mark, with no break offered or requested, Detective Chen introduced the next piece of evidence, the Ring doorbell footage showing someone in an identical emerald green coat approaching Shannon Val's home at 3:22 a.m. "This is interesting timing, Sarah," Chen observed. "Just 35 minutes after you left your apartment, someone wearing what appears to be the exact same distinctive coat approaches your mother's front door." Sarah's response shifted to indignation, her news anchor voice becoming more pronounced as she straightened in her chair. "That's a common style," she insisted, though the coat's unusual color and distinctive gold buttons were clearly visible in both images. Half the women in Austin probably own a similar coat. That could be anyone. Anderson then silently placed a printout of Sarah's Instagram post showing her in the studio wearing the identical coat, with her own caption describing it as a custom piece from my favorite local designer. 5 hours into the interrogation, without food or water being offered or requested, Anderson noticed Sarah beginning to show signs of physical discomfort, shifting in her chair, touching her hair more frequently, her makeup beginning to fade under the harsh lighting. Yet remarkably, instead of asking for a break, Sarah pulled a compact mirror and lipstick from her purse, applying a fresh coat while maintaining eye contact with Anderson. "Do you mind?" she asked rhetorically. "I never let myself be seen with faded lipstick." Professional habit. This bizarre behavior, prioritizing appearance during a murder interrogation, prompted Anderson to probe her psychological state more directly. "Sarah, your mother was brutally killed less than 48 hours ago, yet you seem more concerned with how you look than with helping us find her killer," he observed. Sarah's response was chilling in its calculation. "My mother taught me that appearance is everything, Detective. She would expect me to maintain standards, especially in a crisis." The turning point came shortly after the 6-hour mark, when Anderson introduced evidence they'd found in Sarah's apartment, specifically the prescription bottles and receipts for multiple cosmetic procedures. We've calculated that these surgeries cost approximately $113,000 over 2 years, Anderson stated. Yet your annual salary at KTXA is $87,000 and your monthly expenses exceed $9,000. Sarah's demeanor changed subtly. Her broadcast smile remained, but her eyes hardened as she realized the financial investigation had already begun. My mother helped me with expenses, she claimed, the first indication she was shifting blame to Shannon. She wanted me to succeed and understood that appearance is crucial in television. Anderson countered by revealing they had evidence of Shannon's signature being forged on withdrawal forms, showing Sarah side-by-side comparisons of authentic signatures and the forgeries found in her apartment. We've had a handwriting expert make a preliminary review, he lied strategically, and they're confident these forgeries match practice signatures found in your notebook. 8 hours into the interrogation, with Sarah still refusing breaks despite visible fatigue, Anderson played his strongest card, the email Shannon had drafted to Sarah's station manager, threatening to expose both the financial fraud and the secret OnlyFans account. For the first time, Sarah's professional mask slipped completely, her face flushing with anger before she could compose herself. She had no right, Sarah hissed, momentarily forgetting her role as grieving daughter. That account is private, legitimate business. Plenty of news personalities have side ventures. This momentary authentic reaction, focusing on the exposure rather than denying the account's existence, told Anderson volumes about her priorities and potential motive. Sarah quickly attempted to recover, adding, "If this email existed, which I doubt, it just shows my mother's tendency to overreact and make threats she never followed through on." It was during the 9th hour that Sarah requested her first break, not for food or restroom use, but specifically to refresh my makeup. Anderson agreed, having Detective Chen accompany her to the restroom, where Sarah spent nearly 15 minutes meticulously applying foundation, concealer, mascara, and blush, preparing as if for a camera appearance rather than returning to an interrogation. Upon returning, Sarah seemed reinvigorated and bizarrely asked the detectives if they wanted any exclusive comments for their investigation, as if she were granting a news interview rather than being questioned as a suspect in a homicide. This dissociative behavior, treating the interrogation as a media opportunity, further convinced Anderson that Sarah's psychological relationship with reality was profoundly distorted by her media persona. As the interrogation entered its 11th hour, Anderson introduced technical evidence that would prove most damaging to Sarah's alibi, data from her Apple Watch showing a heart rate spike to 140 beats per minute at precisely 3:22 a.m. on the night of the murder, coinciding exactly with the ring footage timestamp and the estimated time of death. Furthermore, the watch's GPS data placed her within 2 blocks of Shannon's home at that exact time, contradicting her revised story of just going for a drive. Sarah's response was to claim her watch must have been malfunctioning or the data manipulated. "Technology isn't always reliable," she stated with the authoritative tone she likely used for news segments on consumer technology. "I've reported on cases of fitness trackers giving false readings. This proves nothing." In the 12th hour, with Sarah showing signs of physical exhaustion despite her continued attempts to maintain her camera-ready appearance, Anderson finally presented the DNA evidence, her skin cells found under Shannon Valle's fingernails, indicating a physical struggle. Most suspects confronted with such damning scientific evidence show signs of defeat or panic, but Sarah's response was unprecedented in Anderson's experience. She laughed. It wasn't a nervous laugh or hysterical release, but a practiced, almost condescending chuckle. "She was always clingy," Sarah said, examining her manicured nails casually. "Always hugging me too tight, fixing my clothes, touching my hair without permission. Of course, her DNA is on me, and vice versa. We saw each other regularly." This dismissive response, reducing physical evidence of a violent struggle to an annoying maternal habit, was noted by both detectives as showing profound lack of empathy and emotional disconnection from normal familial bonds. By the 14th hour, as the interrogation approached midnight, Anderson deployed his final strategy: silence. He placed all the evidence photographs on the table between them: the security footage, the Ring camera still, the broadcast image of Sarah in the identical coat, the DNA results, the GPS data, the financial documents with forged signatures, and finally the blood-stained scarf found in her gym bag. Then he simply sat back and waited. For 6 full minutes, the room remained silent, except for the soft whir of the recording equipment as Sarah Vowell stared at the assembled evidence of her crime. Finally, she looked up and in a moment caught clearly on the interrogation video that would later be played in court. She winked directly at the recording camera before turning back to Anderson. "Well," she said, in her perfect broadcast voice, "this certainly looks bad, doesn't it? But jurors, love a good redemption story, and this is all just circumstantial." Anderson concluded the interrogation at 12:22 a.m., placing Sarah Vowell under arrest for the first-degree murder of Shannon Valley. As he read Sarah her Miranda rights, Detective Chen observed that Sarah seemed more concerned with how her hair looked in the booking photo than with the serious charges being levied against her. When the handcuffs were applied, Sarah asked if she could at least have my good side facing the cameras outside, apparently anticipating media presence despite the late hour. This final request, prioritizing appearance over the gravity of her situation, cemented for both detectives the profound psychological disturbance driving Sarah Vowell, a woman so consumed by her media image and so detached from normal human emotion that even arrest for matricide was processed primarily as a public relations challenge rather than a personal catastrophe. The morning after Sarah Vowell's arrest, the Austin media landscape erupted into a frenzy of coverage, with KTXA finding itself in the unprecedented position of reporting on the arrest of their own evening news anchor for the murder of her mother. Detective David Anderson arrived at headquarters to find news vans parked outside and reporters clamoring for details, the irony not lost on him that many of these journalists had likely worked alongside either Sarah or Shannon Valley during their careers. Inside, the evidence processing team had worked through the night, and their preliminary findings further strengthened the case against Sarah. The blood stain on the silk scarf found in her gym bag was confirmed to match Shannon Valley's blood type, and fabric analysis determined the scarf contained microscopic fragments of the same crystal as the paperweight murder weapon. District Attorney Marjorie Hoffman met with Anderson and the prosecution team, including lead prosecutor Emma Miller, to review the evidence and determine formal charges. "The premeditation element is strong here," Hoffman noted as they examined the timeline, from the financial motives to the deliberate disabling of security cameras to wearing the distinctive coat that she then showcased on television hours later, almost as if flaunting her crime. Miller, a veteran prosecutor with a reputation for handling high-profile cases involving female defendants, was particularly disturbed by the psychological aspects of the case. "We're dealing with someone who appears to have no emotional connection to the act of matricide," she observed, "who treated her interrogation like a media appearance, and who seems to believe she can charm or manipulate her way out of consequences, just as she's apparently done throughout her life." Meanwhile, digital forensics experts continued analyzing Sarah's electronic devices, uncovering a trove of damning evidence. Her search history revealed queries for undetectable poisons. How long do homicide investigations take? And can Apple Watch data be used in court in the weeks leading up to Shannon's murder? Even more disturbing were notes in her phone's memo app outlining what appeared to be multiple murder scenarios, including one labeled Mother Options, that listed various methods, including staged break-in, pill overdose, make it look like suicide, and blunt force, crime of passion defense. The latter had been starred and edited most recently, suggesting Sarah had considered multiple approaches before settling on the method ultimately used to kill Shannon. The financial investigation yielded even more comprehensive evidence of motive. Beyond the $187,430, Sarah had siphoned from her mother's retirement accounts through forged signatures. Investigators discovered she had recently applied for a $500,000 home equity line of credit against Shannon's house using forged power of attorney documents that had been notarized but not yet filed. Additionally, Shannon's life insurance policy had indeed been increased to $2.3 million with Sarah as sole beneficiary. But what Sarah apparently didn't know was that Shannon had added a fraud investigation clause requiring thorough financial review before any payout could be made. These findings painted a picture of escalating financial desperation. Sarah had been running out of funds to steal and was facing imminent exposure by her mother. Further investigation into Sarah's cosmetic procedures revealed an addiction pattern common in image-focused industries. Beginning with minor treatments 3 years earlier, Sarah had progressively undergone more invasive and expensive surgeries, each requiring longer recovery periods that she disguised as vacation time or special assignment travel. Medical records obtained through warrant showed that surgeons had begun expressing concern about body dysmorphic disorder in their notes, with one doctor refusing further procedures 6 months before the murder, documenting that Sarah became hostile and threatening when denied. This psychological component added another dimension to Sarah's motive, as her mother threatened to expose both her financial crimes and her secret online content. She also risked revealing Sarah's cosmetic surgery addiction at a time when Sarah was being passed over for career advancement, attributed, in industry gossip, to aging out of the youthful anchor image. The investigation also uncovered the complex dynamic between Shannon and Sarah Valla through interviews with colleagues from both women's professional circles. Shannon had indeed pushed Sarah into broadcasting at 17, using her position as news director to secure her daughter opportunities other aspiring journalists worked years to earn. Former co-workers described Shannon as ruthlessly controlling of Sarah's career trajectory, image, and even personal relationships, with one longtime camera operator recalling, "Shannon once fired a producer on the spot because he asked Sarah out for coffee." This controlling behavior extended to Shannon selecting Sarah's wardrobe, monitoring her weight, and scripting her spontaneous interview questions, a level of manipulation that continued well into Sarah's 30s, creating a pressure cooker of resentment masked by Sarah's perfect on-air smile. 5 days after Sarah's arrest, the prosecution received perhaps their most compelling piece of evidence, the full analysis of Sarah's Apple Watch data. Not only did it show her heart rate spiking to 140 BPM at the time of the murder, but the watch had also recorded her exact movements through the house via its accelerometer and gyroscope functions. The data showed rapid arm movements consistent with the beating death described in the medical examiner's report, followed by periods of more controlled movement that corresponded with the theorized cleaning and staging of the crime scene. Most damning of all, the watch had captured a partial voice recording activated by mistake during this time, 7 seconds of audio in which Sarah could be heard muttering, "Should have listened, should have just kept quiet," followed by the sound of papers shuffling. As pre-trial detention continued, Sarah's behavior in jail became increasingly concerning to both prosecutors and detention staff. She immediately requested special accommodations, including specific skincare products, access to hairstyling tools, and makeup for her court appearances, requests largely denied as security risks. When informed she would wear standard-issue jumpsuits like all detainees, Sarah reportedly told a corrections officer, "Do you have any idea how many Instagram followers I have? I can't be seen like this." She began offering fellow inmates, and even guards, exclusive interviews for when I'm exonerated, promising to make them famous in exchange for preferential treatment or contraband cosmetics. The most disturbing development came when Sarah's attorney, Thomas Blackwell, a high-profile defense lawyer known for representing wealthy clients, requested a psychiatric evaluation, not because he believed his client was mentally ill, but because Sarah insisted on taking an active role in planning her legal defense, including demands to testify and speak directly to my viewers. Blackwell's notes, later submitted to the court, expressed concern that Sarah appears unable to distinguish between her professional persona and her legal reality, and believes she can persuade a jury through the same techniques she uses to engage a television audience. The evaluation ultimately found Sarah competent to stand trial, with the psychiatrist noting she displayed narcissistic personality traits and profound image obsession, but fully understands the charges against her and the potential consequences. As the prosecution built their case, Emma Miller focused on developing a cohesive narrative that would explain Sarah's psychological state and motive to the jury. The theory that emerged painted Sarah as a woman who had never been allowed to develop an identity separate from the one her mother created for her, the perfect poised news anchor with the camera-ready smile. As Sarah aged and her value in the youth-obsessed television industry diminished, her desperate attempts to maintain her appearance through secret surgeries drained her finances, leading to theft from her mother. When Shannon discovered these thefts, along with Sarah's secret online content that contradicted her wholesome public image, the threat of exposure became a death sentence for the mother who had both created and now threatened to destroy Sarah's carefully constructed persona. 10 weeks after Shannon Valle's murder, as the pretrial hearing approached, jail staff reported finding Sarah recording audio notes into a contraband device smuggled in by a trustee she had manipulated. The recordings revealed Sarah developing content for a true crime podcast she planned to launch called Wrongfully Accused: The Sarah Valle Story, in which she would document her journey through the broken justice system. The most chilling aspect of these recordings wasn't the content itself, but Sarah's delivery. She spoke in her professional broadcaster voice, complete with dramatic pauses and the practiced empathetic tone she had used when reporting on other tragic events during her news career. She had found a way to transform even her own prosecution for matricide into content, another performance for an audience, revealing the profound disconnect between her understanding of reality and her media-constructed identity. In preparation for the preliminary hearing, Emma Miller met with Detective Anderson to review their presentation strategy. "We need to be prepared for her to treat the courtroom like a studio," Miller warned, "to perform for the jury and cameras rather than engage with the legal process authentically." Anderson nodded, remembering Sarah's wink at the interrogation room camera. "She doesn't seem to grasp that this isn't a ratings competition or image management challenge," he observed. "It's a murder trial with life imprisonment at stake." Neither realized just how accurate their concerns would prove, nor how Sarah Valle's courtroom behavior would ultimately seal her fate in ways even the substantial physical evidence could not fully accomplish. The Travis County Courthouse buzzed with unprecedented activity on the morning of Sarah Valle's preliminary hearing. The marble hallways crowded with local journalists, curious courthouse staff, and members of the public hoping for a glimpse of the fallen news anchor. Security had been doubled after Sarah's defense attorney reported receiving concerning messages from fans of Sarah who believed her innocent despite the mounting evidence. Detective David Anderson arrived early, observing the circus-like atmosphere with concern, This kind of media attention could complicate jury selection if the case proceeded to trial as expected. He spotted prosecutor Emma Miller conferring with her team near the courtroom doors, her expression serious as she reviewed notes for what would be the first public presentation of evidence against Sarah Valle. Inside the courtroom, officers from the sheriff's department conducted final security checks before the defendant's arrival. Judge Lorraine Vasquez, a no-nonsense jurist with 22 years on the bench, had already issued strict decorum orders prohibiting cameras inside the courtroom, a decision that sparked protests from media organizations, but which the judge maintained was necessary to preserve the dignity of proceedings that promised to be sensational enough without additional theatrical elements. At precisely 9:30 a.m., a side door opened and Sarah Valle entered, flanked by corrections officers. Her appearance shocked many observers who knew her only from television. Without access to her usual styling tools, hair products, and makeup artists, she looked noticeably different, though she had clearly done her best with the limited cosmetics allowed in detention. Sarah scanned the courtroom immediately, her eyes seeking out cameras before remembering they were banned, then locating the sketch artists positioned in the front row. Anderson watched as she visibly adjusted her posture, tilting her chin to what she likely considered her most photogenic angle. The news anchor habits apparently impossible to break even in these circumstances. Defense attorney Thomas Blackwell leaned in to whisper something to his client, likely reminding her of their discussed strategy, but Sarah seemed only partially engaged, her attention repeatedly drifting to the packed public gallery. Judge Vasquez called the court to order, and the preliminary hearing to determine whether sufficient evidence existed to proceed to trial began with the prosecution's opening statement. Emma Miller approached the podium with measured steps, her navy suit deliberately understated compared to Sarah's still stylish appearance despite jail limitations. "Your Honor," she began, "the state will present evidence today demonstrating not only that Sarah Valle deliberately and with premeditation murdered her mother, Shannon Valle, but that she did so for financial gain to prevent exposure of her fraudulent activities and with a disturbing lack of remorse or human feeling that challenges our understanding of family bonds." Miller then methodically outlined the evidence, the financial fraud and theft from Shannon's accounts, the threatening email Shannon had drafted to Sarah's employers, the Ring camera footage showing someone in the distinctive emerald green coat approaching Shannon's home, the identical coat worn by Sarah on broadcast television hours after discovering her mother's body, and, perhaps most damning, Sarah's Apple Watch data placing her at the crime scene during the exact window when the medical examiner determined Shannon had been killed. Throughout Miller's presentation, Anderson observed Sarah's reactions carefully, noting she maintained what appeared to be practiced attentive expressions, nodding slightly at appropriate moments, maintaining neutral facial expressions when damaging evidence was mentioned, occasionally writing notes to her attorney that, from Anderson's angle, appeared to contain questions about camera positions and lighting rather than legal strategy. When Miller described the brutal nature of Shannon's death, multiple blows to the head with the crystal paperweight, defensive wounds suggesting Shannon had fought desperately for her life, Sarah displayed no visible emotional reaction, instead using a pause in Miller's presentation to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, in a gesture Anderson had seen her use frequently during her news broadcasts. The first witness called was the medical examiner, Dr. Elaine Ramirez, who presented detailed findings about Shannon Valle's cause of death, complete with autopsy photographs that caused several spectators to look away, but which Sarah viewed without visible distress. Dr. Ramirez testified that the pattern and force of the blows indicated a highly personal attack, driven by extreme emotion rather than efficiency, further noting that several blows had been delivered after Shannon was already incapacitated, suggesting rage beyond what was necessary to cause death. Throughout this graphic testimony, Sarah maintained a composed expression, occasionally whispering to her attorney, but showing none of the distress typical of family members hearing such details about a loved one's violent death. Anderson himself was called to testify next, describing the crime scene as first encountered and the subsequent investigation that led to Sarah's arrest. When he reached the portion of his testimony concerning Sarah's behavior during the 14-hour interrogation, her demeanor in the courtroom subtly shifted. She sat straighter, her eyes fixed on him with what appeared to be professional assessment rather than personal engagement with the accusations. Anderson detailed how Sarah had applied makeup twice during questioning about her mother's murder, how she had winked at the camera, and how she had asked if the detectives wanted exclusive comments for their investigation, as if conducting a media interview rather than responding to accusations of matricide. The most dramatic moment of Anderson's testimony came when he was asked about Sarah's response to being confronted with DNA evidence, her skin cells found under Shannon's fingernails. When presented with this scientific evidence suggesting a physical struggle with the victim, Anderson stated, Ms. Valle laughed and said, and I quote, "She was always clingy." This response, dismissing evidence of her mother fighting for her life as merely an annoying personal habit, struck both myself and Detective Chen as displaying profound lack of normal human empathy or appropriate emotional response. At this testimony, murmurs spread through the courtroom, and Anderson noticed several jurors glancing at Sarah with newly troubled expressions. Following Anderson's testimony, the prosecution introduced the technical evidence. First, the Ring camera footage showing the figure in the emerald green trench coat approaching Shannon's home at 3:22 a.m. Then security footage from Sarah's apartment building showing her leaving at 2:47 a.m., wearing the identical coat, and returning at 4:05 a.m. without it. Most damaging was the side-by-side comparison with Sarah's news broadcast from later that same day. Wearing what expert testimony confirmed was the same distinctive coat, a custom piece from a local Austin designer who testified she had made only one in that particular shade of emerald green, with those specific gold buttons, custom designed for Sarah Valle 6 months earlier. The Apple Watch data presented perhaps the most technically compelling evidence. Digital forensics expert Dr. Marcus Wong walked the court through the detailed movement and heart rate data extracted from Sarah's device. The watch records not just location via GPS, but also patterns of arm movement, elevation changes, heart rate, and occasionally ambient sound if the wearer activates certain functions, Dr. Wong explained. He then displayed charts showing Sarah's heart rate, spiking to 140 beats per minute at precisely 3:22 a.m., the exact timestamp on the Ring camera footage and within the medical examiner's estimated time of death window. Furthermore, Dr. Wong continued, the accelerometer data shows rapid, forceful arm movements consistent with the beating death described by the medical examiner, followed by more controlled movements consistent with someone cleaning or arranging items at the scene. The partial voice recording captured by the watch proved particularly chilling when played in the silent courtroom. 7 seconds of Sarah's voice muttering, "Should have listened, should have just kept quiet," followed by the sound of papers shuffling. Voice analysis experts testified to 99.7% certainty that the voice belonged to Sarah Valle, matching it against hundreds of hours of her broadcast recordings. During this presentation, Anderson observed Sarah's first genuine emotional reaction of the proceedings, a momentary widening of her eyes and tightening of her jaw, before she quickly resumed her neutral expression, suggesting she had been unaware her watch had captured this damning audio. The financial evidence presented by forensic accountant Jessica Barnett detailed the extent of Sarah's theft from her mother's accounts, 187,000 fortherted over 18 months, accomplished through forged signatures on withdrawal forms and transfer authorizations. Barnett testified that Shannon had begun documenting these discrepancies approximately 3 months before her murder, compiling evidence of the forgeries and unauthorized withdrawals in a hidden folder on her computer. Additionally, Barnett presented evidence of Sarah's financial desperation, maxed-out credit cards, minimal savings despite her anchor salary, and luxury expenses, including the downtown apartment, designer wardrobe, and most significantly, over $113,000 in cosmetic procedures that appeared to be the primary drain on her finances. The prosecution's final witness was Dr. Rebecca Stein, the psychiatrist who had evaluated Sarah for competency to stand trial. While she confirmed Sarah was legally competent, her professional observations proved damaging to the defense. Ms. Vale displays characteristics consistent with narcissistic personality disorder, with particular fixation on her public image and appearance, Dr. Stein testified. In our evaluation sessions, she expressed more concern about how she would be perceived by the public than about the legal consequences of the charges against her. Most tellingly, she repeatedly referred to herself in the third person when discussing the case, as if Sarah Vale were a character she was analyzing rather than her own identity. This psychological assessment helped contextualize Sarah's bizarre behavior, both during the investigation and in the courtroom, suggesting her emotional disconnection from the crime stemmed from profound personality dysfunction rather than calculated coldness. Throughout the day-long hearing, Sarah's attorney, Thomas Blackwell, made various objections and attempted to challenge the evidence, particularly the Apple Watch data, arguing it could have been corrupted or misinterpreted. However, his cross-examination seemed hampered by his client's apparent disinterest in technical defense strategies. Several times he paused to confer with Sarah, only to appear visibly frustrated after their whispered exchanges. Anderson, watching these interactions, suspected Sarah was continuing to focus on performance aspects rather than legal substance, a theory confirmed when he overheard her asking Blackwell during a recess if she would be allowed to address my viewers directly before the judge's ruling. As the preliminary hearing neared its conclusion, Prosecutor Emma Miller approached the bench for her closing statement. Your Honor, the evidence presented today establishes not just probable cause, but overwhelming proof that Sarah Vale murdered her mother with premeditation and for financial gain. The physical evidence, DNA, blood evidence, the murder weapon with her fingerprints partially wiped but still detectable, places her at the scene. The technical evidence, security footage, Ring camera video, and particularly the Apple Watch data, establishes her presence during the exact window when Shannon Vale was killed. The financial evidence provides clear motive. Sarah Vale was stealing from her mother, who had discovered the theft and was threatening to expose her, potentially destroying her career and public image. And perhaps most disturbingly, Sarah Vale's own behavior throughout the investigation and these proceedings displays a profound disconnection from the gravity of matricide, treating this process more like a media challenge than a reckoning with having taken her mother's life. In a moment that would later be described by courtroom observers as chillingly surreal, as Miller concluded her powerful summary of evidence, the prosecution played the Ring camera footage one final time, showing the figure in the emerald green coat approaching Shannon Vale's door at 3:22 a.m. As all eyes in the courtroom fixed on the projection screen, Detective Anderson observed something extraordinary. Sarah Vale turned away from the screen, looked directly at the courtroom sketch artists, and gave what every regular viewer of KTXA News would recognize as her signature on-air smile, complete with the slight head tilt she used when transitioning to human interest stories. This bizarre performance, caught by multiple sketch artists and described in detail by courtroom reporters, would become the defining image of the case. A woman seemingly incapable of comprehending that a murder trial was not another broadcast opportunity, that her mother's violent death was not a ratings event, but a real, irreversible tragedy for which she would be held accountable. Judge Vasquez, who had observed this disturbing display along with everyone else in the courtroom, took only 15 minutes of deliberation before returning with her ruling. Based on the substantial evidence presented, she stated firmly, this court finds probable cause to believe that Sarah Valle did commit the crime of first-degree murder as charged. The defendant will be held without bail pending trial. As Sarah was led from the courtroom, Anderson noticed she maintained perfect posture, her eyes scanning the gallery one last time, as if searching for cameras that weren't there, still performing for an audience, even as she was returned to a cell to await trial for killing the mother who had first pushed her onto the public stage. She now couldn't seem to leave, even when facing life imprisonment. The months between Sarah Valle's preliminary hearing and the start of her murder trial witnessed a series of unusual developments that reinforced the prosecution's portrayal of a defendant fundamentally disconnected from the gravity of her situation. Travis County Detention Center staff documented Sarah's persistent efforts to maintain her public image despite incarceration. She filed formal complaints about the lighting in visitation areas being unflattering for meetings with legal counsel, requested special permission to receive hair coloring products to maintain her broadcast-ready appearance, and attempted to organize fellow inmates to petition for better quality mirrors in the women's housing unit. Defense attorney Thomas Blackwell found himself increasingly frustrated by his client's priorities, noting in a sealed communication to the court that Sarah spent their strategy sessions fixated on how she will appear to the jury visually rather than engaging with legal arguments or evidence review. As jury selection approached in early November, a disturbing discovery further complicated the defense's already challenging position. Jail communications monitoring flagged a series of coded messages Sarah had been sending to a former production assistant from KTXA, instructing this individual to create social media accounts under the name Justice for Sarah Valle and coordinate what appeared to be a public relations campaign. The messages, concealed within seemingly innocuous personal letters, included detailed instructions for narrative framing. Emphasize mother's controlling history. Use words like psychological abuse and coercion repeatedly. Find former colleagues willing to say Shannon was widely feared in the industry. This discovery led to additional charges of attempted witness tampering and triggered a complete review of all Sarah's communications during detention. District Attorney Marjorie Hoffman personally joined prosecutor Emma Miller for jury selection, recognizing the unique challenges of seating an impartial jury in a case involving a well-known local media figure. Potential jurors were extensively questioned about their television viewing habits, whether they had watched Sarah Valle's newscasts, and if they had formed opinions based on media coverage of the case. Defense motions for change of venue due to pre-trial publicity were denied by Judge Vasquez, who instead implemented enhanced voir dire procedures and an expanded jury pool to ensure selection of 12 jurors and 4 alternates who could fairly evaluate evidence despite Sarah's local celebrity status. The final jury composition included 7 women and 5 men ranging in age from 28 to 67, with occupations spanning healthcare, education, technology, and construction, deliberately excluding anyone with media industry connections. On November 12, 2023, Sarah Valle's murder trial began with opening statements from both sides. The courtroom was packed with media representatives, legal observers, and members of the public who had lined up before dawn to secure seats. Sarah entered wearing a conservative navy blue dress, her hair styled as professionally as possible given detention limitations, and immediately located the court sketch artists, offering them what Detective Anderson recognized as her practiced camera-ready smile. Emma Miller's opening statement for the prosecution was methodical and powerful, walking jurors through the narrative of a daughter who had stolen from her mother, faced exposure of both financial crimes and secret online activities, and chose murder rather than accountability. This case, Miller told the riveted jury, is about image versus reality, the carefully constructed public persona of Sarah Valle, trusted news anchor, versus the private reality of a woman who killed her own mother to protect that manufactured image. Defense attorney Blackwell's opening offered the strategy he had apparently convinced Sarah to pursue despite her initial reluctance, portraying Shannon Valle as a controlling, psychologically abusive stage mother who had manipulated and exploited her daughter from adolescence. Sarah Valle never had a chance to develop her own identity, Blackwell argued, from age 17. She was molded into a commercial product by a mother who saw her as an extension of her own ambitions rather than as an autonomous person. While carefully avoiding directly admitting that Sarah had killed Shannon, the defense narrative suggested that if violence had occurred, it represented the desperate final act in a lifetime of coercive control and exploitation. This strategy attempted to leverage Shannon's documented controlling behavior as a partial justification, though stopping short of a formal insanity or diminished capacity defense, which psychological evaluations could not support. The prosecution's case unfolded over 3 weeks, with Miller methodically presenting the evidence established during the preliminary hearing while adding significant new elements. Crime scene analysts testified to the significance of blood spatter patterns in Shannon's home, demonstrating that the attack had begun near the home office where financial documents were spread across the desk, suggesting a confrontation over the discovered fraud had triggered the violence. Digital forensics experts presented a more comprehensive analysis of Sarah's electronic devices, including recently recovered deleted text messages between Sarah and her mother, where Shannon had demanded a meeting to discuss financial discrepancies, and Sarah had responded with increasingly hostile messages culminating in, "You've controlled my life for 34 years. That ends now." The most powerful new evidence came from Shannon Valle's email account, where investigators had recovered an unsent draft to her attorney written the day before her murder. In this email, Shannon expressed fear of her daughter's increasingly erratic behavior, writing, "Sarah seems to be living in a reality of her own creation. When confronted with bank statements showing her forgeries, she simply smiled and denied everything as if I couldn't see the evidence with my own eyes. I'm afraid of what might happen when I show her the certified copies I've obtained and the report from the handwriting expert. There's something wrong with her ability to distinguish truth from the narrative she's created." This haunting assessment from the victim, describing exactly the psychological disconnection Sarah continued to display throughout the legal proceedings, resonated powerfully with the jury, several of whom were observed studying Sarah's impassive reaction as the email was read aloud. Anderson testified for 2 full days, providing detailed accounts of the investigation, and particularly the 14-hour interrogation that had revealed so much about Sarah's psychological state. The prosecution played extended excerpts from the interrogation video showing Sarah applying makeup while being questioned about her mother's murder, winking at the camera, and making her chilling response when confronted with DNA evidence. She was always clingy. The jury watched with visible discomfort as Sarah on video dismissed physical evidence of her mother's desperate struggle for life as merely an annoying personal habit. Several jurors, glancing between the recorded Sarah and the defendant sitting before them, seemingly searching for signs of authentic emotion that remained absent in both versions. Financial evidence formed a crucial component of establishing motive, with forensic accountants meticulously tracking the flow of stolen funds from Shannon's accounts to Sarah's secret expenditures. Bank records revealed that in the week before the murder, Shannon had frozen several accounts and initiated fraud investigations with 2 financial institutions, actions that would have soon exposed Sarah's schemes even without Shannon's direct intervention. The life insurance policy was examined in detail, with the prosecution demonstrating that Sarah had actively encouraged her mother to increase the coverage to $2.3 million 6 months earlier, using fear of inadequate end-of-life care as motivation while ensuring she remained the sole beneficiary, a manipulation that suggested long-term planning rather than a spontaneous crime of passion. The defense case, beginning in early December, focused heavily on Shannon Vallée's controlling behavior throughout Sarah's life and career. Former colleagues from various television stations testified to Shannon's reputation as a demanding, sometimes ruthless news director who had leveraged her industry power to advance her daughter's career, while simultaneously micromanaging every aspect of Sarah's professional development. Sarah's former agent described watching Shannon reduce her adult daughter to tears by criticizing her delivery of a breaking news segment, insisting she re-record practice takes in their home studio for hours until achieving what Shannon deemed acceptable presentation. A makeup artist recalled Shannon carrying a notebook documenting Sarah's weight fluctuations down to the half pound, scheduling intervention meetings if Sarah gained even minimal weight that might be noticeable on camera. The defense also presented testimony from Dr. Eleanor Hammond, a psychiatrist specializing in parent-child relationship trauma, who had evaluated Sarah after her arrest. While not supporting an insanity defense, Dr. Hammond testified that Sarah displayed characteristics consistent with prolonged psychological captivity within a controlling relationship, comparing the dynamics to those seen in cases of extended domestic abuse. When one person controls another's career, appearance, finances, and public identity from adolescence through adulthood, Dr. Hammond explained, the controlled individual may develop survival mechanisms that involve separating their authentic self from their performed self, eventually leading to profound identity confusion and reality distortion. This testimony aimed to contextualize Sarah's bizarre behavior not as narcissistic performance, but as psychological adaptation to lifelong control. Despite Blackwell's strong presentation of this narrative, his case suffered from a fundamental weakness: Sarah's insistence on testifying in her own defense, despite his strenuous private advice against it. When Sarah took the stand on December 11th, the courtroom fell into expectant silence, many observers anticipating this would be the ultimate performance from a woman who had spent her adult life in front of cameras. Sarah was sworn in wearing a simple gray dress, her hair pulled back in a style more subdued than her usual broadcast appearance, in what Anderson recognized as a deliberate visual strategy to present a more sympathetic image to the jury. For the first 30 minutes of direct examination by Blackwell, Sarah followed their prepared strategy, describing her mother's controlling behavior, the pressure to maintain impossible standards, and the psychological toll of having her identity shaped entirely around her media career. The critical shift occurred when Blackwell asked about the night of Shannon's death. Rather than maintaining the careful partial defense they had constructed, acknowledging presence but suggesting emotional breakdown or self-defense, Sarah launched into what could only be described as an alternative narrative, completely disconnected from the established evidence. "I was home all night," she testified with the confident delivery of a breaking news announcement, directly contradicting not only the prosecution's evidence, but also her defense team's own strategy. "I never left my apartment. I never went to my mother's house, and I certainly never harmed her. The coat in the Ring video isn't even mine. Mine has different buttons. Anyone who watches my broadcasts regularly would know that." This testimony, delivered with perfect anchorwoman diction and eye contact with the jury, created visible consternation at the defense table, with Blackwell subtly attempting to redirect his client back to their discussed approach. Prosecutor Emma Miller's cross-examination of Sarah Vale became the defining moment of the trial, a methodical dismantling of self-delusion that revealed the profound extent of Sarah's disconnection from reality. Miller began by establishing Sarah's training as a journalist, her familiarity with evidence standards, and her professional experience reporting on criminal cases. She then systematically presented each piece of evidence: the security footage, the Ring camera video, the Apple Watch data, the DNA findings, the financial records, asking after each one, "Ms. Vale, as a professional journalist, how would you evaluate the credibility of this evidence?" Sarah's responses became increasingly detached from rational assessment, insisting that technology could be manipulated, that identical emerald green coats were common in Austin despite the designer's testimony that hers was unique, and that her mother must have invited someone else into the home who was responsible for the murder. The most devastating exchange occurred when Miller played the partial voice recording from Sarah's Apple Watch, capturing her saying, "Should have listened, should have just kept quiet," at the crime scene. "Ms. Vale," Miller asked with measured precision, "do you recognize the voice in this recording?" Sarah's response left the courtroom in stunned silence. "That sounds like my broadcast voice, but I don't recall saying those words. Perhaps it's from one of my new segments about a different crime case." This answer, suggesting she could not distinguish between reporting on crime and committing it, between her professional persona and her actual actions, confirmed for many observers the profound psychological dissociation that had enabled Sarah to murder her mother and then report on camera wearing the same distinctive coat hours later. As Miller's cross-examination continued into its second day, Sarah became increasingly flustered when pressed on financial details, at one point claiming she didn't need to steal because she had plenty of income from endorsements and appearance fees, despite tax records showing no such additional income. When confronted with bank surveillance photos showing her depositing checks with her mother's forged signature, Sarah suggested the images had been altered or that perhaps her mother had given permission for her to sign the checks, directly contradicting her earlier testimony that she had never signed her mother's name. These contradictions mounted until Sarah finally responded to one particularly damning piece of evidence by looking directly at the jury and stating, "You have to understand, in television news, we often have to create a coherent narrative from complicated facts. That's what's missing here. A coherent narrative that makes sense of all these misleading pieces of information." This statement, essentially admitting she viewed trial evidence the way she might approach crafting a news story, prioritizing narrative over factual accuracy, provided the prosecution with the perfect encapsulation of Sarah's fundamental disconnect from legal reality. In her closing argument, Miller returned to this statement, telling the jury, "Sarah Vale has told you exactly how she sees this process, not as a search for truth based on evidence, but as a production challenge, a narrative to be crafted regardless of facts. She approached her mother's murder the same way, as a problem of presentation rather than a moral or human question. Shannon Vale died because she threatened to expose the truth behind her daughter's carefully constructed false narrative. And Sarah Vale sits before you today, still believing she can script reality more convincingly than evidence can reveal it." The jury deliberated for just 7 hours before returning with their verdict on December 18, 2023. As the courtroom settled into tense silence, Sarah Vale maintained perfect posture at the defense table, her expression composed in what Anderson recognized as her serious news face, the same expression she had used when reporting on tragedies during her broadcast career. When the jury foreman read "guilty of murder in the first degree," Sarah's expression didn't change, though Blackwell placed a supportive hand on her arm. It was only when the foreman continued, "with special circumstances of financial gain and lying in wait, ensuring she would face life imprisonment without possibility of parole, that Sarah's mask finally slipped. For a brief, unguarded moment, genuine shock registered on her face, before she quickly reassembled her composed expression, turning to look not at her attorney but at the courtroom sketch artists, offering them one last perfectly composed image of dignity in the face of adversity, a final broadcast to an audience that now saw through the performance to the empty reality beneath. The sentencing phase of Sarah Valle's trial began 3 weeks after her conviction, following the Christmas and New Year's holidays, a period during which the case continued to dominate Austin media coverage and inspired numerous national true crime podcast episodes. Detective David Anderson, having wrapped up his formal involvement with the successful prosecution, spent the holiday period reviewing the extensive case files and reflecting on the disturbing psychology that had allowed a woman to murder her mother and then literally wear evidence of the crime on television hours later. The sentencing hearing would normally be a straightforward procedural matter given the first-degree murder conviction with special circumstances which mandated life imprisonment without parole under Texas law. But Judge Vasquez had allowed for extensive victim impact statements and granted the unusual request from Sarah's defense team for her to make her own statement to the court. On January 8, 2024, the Travis County Courthouse once again filled with spectators, journalists, and legal observers for the sentencing hearing. Anderson arrived early, noting that courthouse security had been increased after several concerning letters had been received by the court clerk from individuals identifying themselves as fans of Sarah Valle, who believed in her innocence despite the overwhelming evidence and jury verdict. Emma Miller had shared with Anderson that these letters displayed disturbing patterns. Many writers claimed to have special insight into Sarah based on watching her for years on television, believing they knew the real Sarah in ways the jury couldn't understand. This parasocial phenomenon, viewers forming one-sided emotional connections with media figures, added another disturbing layer to a case already defined by the blurring of media performance and reality. Sarah Valle entered the courtroom in the same composed manner she had maintained throughout the trial, though Anderson observed subtle differences in her appearance. Without regular access to hair color treatments during her months in detention, her natural dark roots now showed beneath the honey blonde that had been her broadcast signature. She had lost weight, her cheekbones more pronounced than in her news anchor days, yet she had clearly done everything possible within detention limitations to maintain her camera-ready appearance. As she took her seat beside defense attorney Thomas Blackwell, Sarah immediately located the courtroom sketch artists and adjusted her posture slightly, tilting her chin in what Anderson had come to recognize as her preferred angle for visual documentation, a habitual performance so ingrained it appeared to be unconscious. Judge Lorraine Vasquez began the proceedings by explaining the purpose of the sentencing hearing, noting that while the mandatory sentence was predetermined by statute, given the conviction, the court would hear from those impacted by Shannon Valle's murder before formally pronouncing sentence. The first to speak was Robert Valle, Shannon's ex-husband and Sarah's father, who had flown in from Florida, where he had relocated after the divorce 15 years earlier. His testimony provided new insight into the family dynamics that had shaped both victim and perpetrator. Shannon was brilliant, driven, and completely uncompromising, he stated in a voice tight with emotion. When Sarah showed an interest in broadcasting as a teenager, Shannon saw it as a chance to create the career she believed she deserved, but never fully achieved due to the gender barriers of her era. Robert Valle's testimony painted a complex picture of a household dominated by Shannon's ambitions for her daughter. By the time Sarah was 17, our home had been transformed into a broadcast training facility, teleprompter practice in the dining room, vocal exercises at breakfast, wardrobe consultations instead of normal mother-daughter shopping trips. He described watching his daughter's natural personality gradually submerged beneath the polished persona Shannon crafted for television, creating what he called two Sarahs, the authentic young woman with normal emotions and vulnerabilities, and the perfectly composed broadcast personality who eventually seemed to take over. The last time I saw genuine emotion from my daughter was when she was 19, he testified, his voice breaking. After that, even in private family moments, she seemed to be performing rather than experiencing life. Several of Shannon Valle's colleagues and friends spoke next, describing the victim's professional accomplishments and personal qualities while acknowledging her controlling tendencies, particularly regarding her daughter. Darlene Jenkins, who had worked with Shannon for 12 years at KTXN, described watching the mother-daughter relationship deteriorate as Sarah entered her 30s. Shannon had created Sarah for a specific window of opportunity in television, the young, attractive female anchor with a wholesome image, but enough sophistication to be taken seriously, Jenkins testified. When Sarah began to age out of that narrow demographic sweet spot around 33 or 34, Shannon became almost panicked, pushing her toward cosmetic procedures, more youthful wardrobe choices, even suggesting she pursue younger male companions who might be photographed with her to reinforce her youthful image. The most powerful victim impact statement came from Maria Gutierrez, Shannon's housekeeper for over a decade, who had discovered Shannon's body alongside Sarah on the morning after the murder. Unlike Sarah, who had appeared composed and camera-ready at the crime scene, Maria had been genuinely traumatized by the discovery, requiring hospitalization and ongoing therapy. Ms. Shannon was not perfect, but she did not deserve such violence, Maria testified through tears. When we found her, I fell to my knees crying, but Miss Sarah just stood there, checking her phone, telling me not to touch anything because it might be evidence. She asked me to wait outside for police because she needed a moment alone with her mother. But through the window, I saw her checking her reflection in the hallway mirror and fixing her lipstick while Ms. Shannon lay dead on the floor. This testimony visibly affected several jurors who had returned to observe the sentencing, though Sarah herself maintained her composed expression. Following the victim impact statements, Judge Vasquez granted the defense's request for Sarah to address the court before sentencing. As Sarah rose and approached the podium, a palpable tension filled the courtroom. Would she finally acknowledge her crime and express genuine remorse, or continue the performance of innocence that had characterized her trial testimony despite the overwhelming evidence of her guilt? Sarah adjusted the microphone with the practiced gesture of a broadcaster, squared her shoulders, and began speaking in what Anderson immediately recognized as her human interest story voice, warm, intimate, with precisely modulated emotional undertones, the voice she had used when reporting on inspirational community members or heartwarming animal rescues. Your Honor, members of the court, and to everyone watching these proceedings, Sarah began, immediately framing her statement as a broadcast to an audience rather than an address to the judge. First, I want to express my profound grief over the loss of my mother, Shannon Valle, a pioneering woman in Texas journalism who shaped not only my career, but the careers of countless broadcasters across this state. She continued with what sounded like a prepared obituary rather than a personal reflection, listing Shannon's professional accomplishments and awards, while avoiding any mention of their complicated personal relationship or the financial crimes that had preceded the murder. Anderson observed Judge Vasquez's expression growing increasingly concerned as Sarah's statement continued in this disconnected vein, completely avoiding the reality of her conviction. 10 minutes into her statement, having still not acknowledged her role in Shannon's death, Sarah pivoted to what appeared to be a prepared speech about media integrity and rush to judgment, suggesting that her case represented a failure of investigative standards. As someone who has reported on hundreds of criminal cases during my career at KTXA, she stated with the authoritative tone she had used for serious news segments, I understand how easily circumstantial evidence can create a compelling but ultimately misleading narrative. What appears to be a coherent story may actually be a series of coincidences and misinterpreted data points. This attempt to frame her conviction as a cautionary tale about narrative fallacies, rather than the result of overwhelming physical, digital, and financial evidence, prompted Judge Vasquez to interrupt. Ms. Valle, the judge stated firmly, this is not a press conference or editorial segment. You have been convicted by a jury of your peers based on substantial evidence. This statement opportunity is traditionally used to express remorse, reflection, or to address the impact of your actions. Do you understand the purpose of this proceeding? Sarah's response revealed the profound disconnection that had characterized the entire case. Yes, Your Honor, I'm providing context for viewers, for the court, to understand the broader implications of my situation. This slip, momentarily revealing her continued perception of legal proceedings as media content, caused audible reactions in the courtroom and a visible tightening of Judge Vasquez's expression. Sarah attempted to continue her prepared remarks, but the judge interrupted again. Ms. Valle, do you acknowledge that you have been convicted of murdering your mother? The directness of this question seemed to momentarily disrupt Sarah's scripted approach, and for a brief moment, her broadcast persona faltered. The jury has returned that verdict, yes, she responded carefully, still avoiding direct acknowledgement of her actions. And do you have anything to say regarding your responsibility for Shannon Valle's death? The judge pressed. Sarah hesitated, seeming to search for the appropriate performance before responding. I accept that the court process has reached its conclusion, again evading actual admission or remorse, while using the measured tones and neutral phrasing of a news anchor reporting on someone else's legal proceedings. Recognizing the futility of seeking genuine accountability, Judge Vasquez thanked Sarah and asked her to be seated. The judge then addressed the courtroom directly, her voice carrying the weight of moral as well as legal authority. Throughout these proceedings, I have observed in the defendant a profound and disturbing disconnection from the gravity of her actions and their consequences. Where one would expect to find grief, remorse, or at minimum acknowledgement, we have instead witnessed what appears to be an ongoing performance, as if Ms. Valle believes she can script reality as easily as a news segment. The judge paused, looking directly at Sarah, who maintained her composed expression. The tragedy here extends beyond Shannon Valle's violent death to encompass the psychological condition that allowed her daughter to commit such an act, and then appear on television wearing the very coat captured at the crime scene, smiling into the camera with her mother's blood, figuratively, if not literally, still on her hands. Judge Vasquez then formally pronounced sentence, life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, to be served at the Mountain View unit of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice with court-mandated psychiatric treatment. As the sentence was read, Anderson observed Sarah's reaction carefully, noting that she maintained her camera-ready composure until the mention of psychiatric treatment, at which point a momentary flash of genuine indignation crossed her face, perhaps the most authentic emotion she had displayed throughout the entire proceedings. This brief crack in her performance suggested that while Sarah could accept incarceration as an unfortunate plot development in her life story, she fundamentally rejected the notion that her psychology required treatment, still believing her performed reality more valid than the factual one established by evidence and jury verdict. As Sarah was led from the courtroom by deputies, she turned for one final look at the assembled media, courtroom artists, and spectators, offering what every regular KTXA viewer would recognize as her signature sign-off expression, a slight tilt of the head, a composed smile with precisely the right balance of gravity and warmth, the expression she had used countless times when concluding reports on serious matters before transitioning to her co-anchor. Even in this final moment, handcuffed and convicted of matricide, Sarah Volley remained trapped in her broadcast persona, performing for an audience that now saw through the polished veneer to the emptiness beneath. Anderson, watching this final performance, reflected on the case's most disturbing implication, that years of manufactured emotion and practiced responses had so thoroughly hollowed out Sarah Volley's authentic self that she had become capable of murdering her own mother without experiencing genuine emotional connection to the act, treating matricide as simply another scene to be navigated with appropriate camera presence. 3 months into Sarah Volley's incarceration at the Mountain View unit of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, Detective David Anderson received an unusual request from the facility's chief psychiatrist, Dr. Natasha Reeves. Mountain View, located in Gatesville, about 2 hours north of Austin, housed the state's female death row inmates, along with those serving long sentences for violent crimes. Dr. Reeves had been assigned to evaluate and treat Sarah as part of her court-mandated psychiatric care, and what she had discovered prompted her to reach out to the lead investigator on the case. "Detective," Reeves explained during their phone conversation, "I believe you should be aware of certain developments regarding inmate Volley. She's established what can only be described as a concerning pattern of behavior that might have implications beyond her individual case." Anderson arranged to visit Mountain View the following week, making the drive through the rolling central Texas landscape on a clear March morning. The facility's stark architecture, concrete and steel, surrounded by multiple security fences topped with razor wire, stood in sharp contrast to the natural beauty of the surrounding countryside. After clearing security protocols, Anderson was escorted to Dr. Reeves's office, a small but organized space with case files stacked neatly on her desk. The psychiatrist, a woman in her late 50s with silver-streaked dark hair and penetrating eyes behind tortoise-shell glasses, greeted Anderson with a firm handshake before closing the door to ensure privacy for their discussion about one of the facility's most high-profile inmates. Sarah Volley presents one of the most textbook cases of narcissistic personality disorder with histrionic features I've encountered in 23 years of forensic psychiatry, Dr. Reeves began, opening a thick file folder. What makes her case particularly fascinating from a clinical perspective is how her television career both shaped and reinforced these traits, creating a feedback loop of performative behavior that eventually erased the boundary between authentic identity and media persona. Anderson nodded, recalling Sarah's courtroom performances and her bizarre behavior during interrogation. "However," Reeves continued with a note of concern, "what prompted me to contact you isn't her diagnosis, which was already established during trial, but rather how she's adapted to incarceration in ways that suggest potential risk beyond her individual case." Dr. Reeves explained that upon arrival at Mountain View, Sarah had initially struggled with the harsh realities of prison life, the loss of control over her appearance, the strict routines, the absence of an audience for her performed self. Within weeks, however, she had developed what Reeves described as an alternative broadcast environment within the facility. She began by offering to help other inmates write appeal letters, correspondence to family members, even personal journals, Reeves explained. But she doesn't simply help them write. She reshapes their narratives entirely, coaching them on how to present themselves as sympathetic characters in a larger story. This behavior had rapidly evolved into Sarah holding what inmates referred to as story sessions in the common area, where she would help women convicted of violent crimes reframe their actions as justifiable responses to oppression, casting them as protagonists rather than perpetrators. Most concerning to Dr. Reeves was the discovery that Sarah had somehow managed to begin recording a clandestine podcast from within the facility. Using a contraband smartphone smuggled in by a corrections officer she had manipulated, the officer had been a regular viewer of her news broadcasts and believed in her innocence despite the evidence. Sarah had recorded 6 episodes of what she called Voices of the Voiceless, Women Behind Bars. Under the pseudonym Isabella Reed, a play on I'm Freed, she narrated stories of female inmates, presenting highly edited versions of their crimes that emphasized societal factors and minimized personal responsibility. She's essentially creating propaganda, Reeves noted, not just for herself, but for anyone willing to provide content for her alternative narrative about female violent offenders. The psychiatrist showed Anderson transcripts from several of these recordings, which had been discovered during a routine cell inspection. In one particularly disturbing episode, Sarah had interviewed a woman serving 40 years for murdering her 3 children, presenting the case as one of maternal sacrifice rather than filicide, suggesting the mother had acted out of a distorted form of protection rather than the revenge against her ex-husband established at trial. What's remarkable, Reeves noted, is how Sarah uses the exact techniques of human interest journalism to generate sympathy, background music cues, strategic pauses, voice modulation. She's essentially producing a professional quality true crime podcast that inverts the actual truth of these cases. Most concerning to both the psychiatrist and now to Anderson was how these recordings were being disseminated. The manipulated corrections officer had been uploading the audio files to a server maintained by one of Sarah's former colleagues at KTXA, who then distributed them through multiple podcast platforms. The podcast had gained a significant following, over 85,000 subscribers in just 2 months, with listeners unaware that E. Reed was actually convicted murderer Sarah Vowell. Comments on the podcast platforms revealed disturbing patterns of viewer response, with many expressing outrage at the injustice faced by the featured inmates based solely on Sarah's carefully crafted narratives, some even organizing letter-writing campaigns to parole boards and prison officials. She's creating a community of believers, Dr. Reeves explained gravely. People who accept her framing of violent crimes as misunderstandings, systemic failures, or justified responses. And she's extraordinarily effective because she's applying professional media techniques honed over years of broadcast experience. The most troubling aspect, from Reeves's perspective, was that Sarah appeared to genuinely believe in her alternative narratives. Psychological evaluations suggested she wasn't simply lying, but had constructed an alternative reality in which she and other violent offenders were protagonists in a story of overcoming adversity rather than perpetrators of serious crimes. In her sessions with me, Reeves shared, she speaks about her mother's murder in the third person, as if analyzing a case she reported on rather than committed. She'll say things like, "The Sarah Vowell case shows how easily circumstantial evidence can create a false narrative without any recognition that she is Sarah Vowell." Anderson reviewed the complete file Dr. Reeves had compiled, including Sarah's psychiatric evaluations, incident reports from the facility, and transcripts of her recorded podcast episodes. A pattern emerged of a woman who had transitioned seamlessly from crafting news narratives to manufacturing alternative realities about violent crimes, using the same techniques that had made her a successful broadcaster. Has she shown any signs of authentic remorse or recognition regarding her mother's murder? Anderson asked. Dr. Reeves shook her head, her expression somber. Quite the opposite. In our most recent session, she explained to me, with perfect broadcast diction and practiced empathetic expression, that her mother's death was tragic but ultimately transformative, because it allowed her to discover her true calling as a voice for incarcerated women. This profound lack of moral recognition, combined with her demonstrated ability to manipulate others and disseminate alternative narratives about violent crimes, prompted the correctional facility to implement enhanced monitoring and restrictions. The corrections officer who had smuggled the smartphone was terminated and faced criminal charges, while Sarah lost privileges and was transferred to more restricted housing. However, as Anderson learned during his visit, these measures had done little to diminish her influence among the inmate population. Even without technology, she had continued her story sessions, teaching other violent offenders how to reframe their narratives in ways that minimized culpability and maximized sympathetic interpretation, essentially creating a school for manipulative self-presentation within the prison walls. After concluding his meeting with Dr. Reeves, Anderson requested permission to speak directly with Sarah Vale, a request granted by the facility warden given his role as the primary investigator in her case. Sarah was brought to an interview room, her appearance notably different from the polished news anchor who had once been a familiar face in Austin living rooms. Prison-issued clothing had replaced her designer wardrobe, and without access to her usual hair and makeup resources, she appeared both older and somehow more authentic than she had during the trial. Yet, despite these physical changes, Anderson immediately recognized that her fundamental performance orientation remained intact. As she entered the room, she adjusted her posture, tilted her head to her preferred angle, and offered him the same practiced smile she had used when transitioning to interview segments during her broadcasts. "Detective Anderson," she greeted him with the warm, intimate tone she had used for human interest stories. "What a pleasant surprise. Are you here for an exclusive interview? I've been developing quite a following for my new series on women's justice issues." This opening line, treating their meeting as a media opportunity rather than a correctional facility interview, confirmed Dr. Reeves's assessment of Sarah's continued disconnection from reality. Anderson maintained a neutral, professional demeanor as he explained he was following up on aspects of the case, carefully observing Sarah's reactions. Throughout their 30-minute conversation, she never once referenced her crime or conviction directly, instead speaking about the Sarah Vale case, as if discussing someone else entirely. Most disturbing was Sarah's description of her new project, what she called narrative reconstruction therapy for her fellow inmates. These women have been silenced by a justice system that only values certain types of stories, she explained, with the authoritative tone she had used for serious news segments. "I'm teaching them how to reclaim their narratives, how to present their experiences in ways people can connect with emotionally." When Anderson pointed out that many of these women had been convicted of violent crimes based on substantial evidence, Sarah's response revealed the depth of her alternate reality. "Evidence is just information, detective. Information requires interpretation to become story. And whoever controls the story controls how evidence is understood." This statement, essentially an admission that she viewed factual reality as malleable through narrative technique, confirmed Anderson's concerns about Sarah's ongoing influence within the correctional system. Before concluding the interview, he asked one final direct question. "Sarah, do you acknowledge that you murdered your mother, Shannon Vale?" The question seemed to momentarily disrupt her performance. A flicker of something, not remorse, but perhaps irritation at the bluntness of the query, crossing her face before she composed herself. "That's the official finding of the court," she replied carefully, "but my podcast explores how official findings often fail to capture the complexity of women's lived experiences." This evasion, framing her conviction as simply one interpretation among many equally valid alternatives, demonstrated the profound moral and cognitive disconnection that had enabled her to commit matricide and now allowed her to avoid authentic reckoning with her actions. Following his visit to Mountain View, Anderson prepared a detailed report for the Travis County District Attorney's Office and the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, recommending enhanced monitoring of Sarah Valle's communications and influence within the prison system. His report specifically highlighted the risk of her techniques spreading beyond the facility through released inmates she had coached in narrative manipulation, potentially undermining public understanding of violent crime and its consequences. The report also noted the disturbing phenomenon of Sarah's podcast followers, who had begun organizing under the banner Justice for Sarah and All Silenced Women, advocating for her case to be reopened despite the overwhelming evidence that had led to her conviction. 6 months after his visit to Mountain View, Anderson received notification that his recommendations had been implemented. Sarah Valle had been transferred to even more restricted housing with limited access to other inmates, her communications more strictly monitored, and the prison had implemented new protocols to identify and address manipulative narrative techniques being used within the inmate population. The podcast had been shut down after its true origin was exposed by investigative journalists, though recordings continued to circulate on darker corners of the Internet, where dedicated followers maintained that Sarah was a political prisoner, silenced for challenging dominant narratives about female agency. As the one-year anniversary of Shannon Valle's murder approached, Anderson found himself reflecting on the case that had revealed so much about the dangerous intersection of media performance, psychological disconnection, and violence. What made Sarah Valle's crime and subsequent behavior so disturbing was not just the act of matricide itself, but the way her media-trained personality had allowed her to compartmentalize the murder as simply another scene to be navigated with appropriate camera presence. Smiling into the broadcast camera, wearing the same distinctive coat captured at the crime scene hours earlier. The case had forced Anderson to reconsider conventional understandings of criminal psychology, confronting the possibility that in a media-saturated culture, some individuals might become so detached from authentic human experience that even murder could be processed primarily as a narrative challenge rather than a moral transgression. In his final case notes, Anderson wrote, "The Sarah Valle case represents a new category of criminal psychology, one in which the performance of normalcy through media techniques has so thoroughly replaced authentic human connection that even the most profound taboo, the murder of one's parent, can be executed without apparent emotional consequence or moral recognition. In a world increasingly dominated by performance and image management, Sarah Valle may represent not an aberration, but a harbinger, the extreme manifestation of a disconnection between authentic and performed self that technology and media culture continue to accelerate throughout society." This assessment would later be included in law enforcement training materials nationwide, as the Sarah Valle case became a landmark study in the emerging field of media psychology and criminal behavior. A cautionary tale about the potential consequences when the line between reporting on violence and committing it becomes blurred in a mind trained to prioritize narrative over reality. 1 year to the day after Shannon Valle's murder, Austin television stations aired special retrospective segments on the case that had shocked the local community and fascinated true crime enthusiasts nationwide. The most comprehensive coverage came from KTXN, Shannon Valle's former employer, which produced a 1-hour documentary titled Beyond the Broadcast, The Sarah Valle Story. The program featured interviews with former colleagues of both Shannon and Sarah, legal experts who had followed the case, and excerpts from Detective David Anderson's first public comments on the investigation. Anderson had initially been reluctant to participate, concerned about contributing to the sensationalism surrounding a tragedy that had already received excessive media attention, but ultimately agreed in hopes of providing educational context about the psychological factors that had enabled such a disturbing crime. What made this case uniquely disturbing, Anderson explained during his interview segment, was how Sarah Vallé's broadcast training and persona enabled her to compartmentalize the murder of her mother as if it were simply another news event to be reported, rather than a profound moral transgression she had committed. He described the chilling moment during Sarah's interrogation when she applied makeup while being questioned about matricide, and her infamous smile to the courtroom cameras while evidence of her guilt was being presented. In my 22 years in homicide investigation, I've encountered many different psychological profiles, but never someone who seemed to process their own violent crime primarily as a media challenge rather than an emotional or moral crisis. The documentary also included the first public interview with Thomas Blackwell, Sarah Vallé's defense attorney, who had maintained professional silence during the immediate aftermath of the trial. Speaking carefully within the bounds of attorney-client privilege, Blackwell nonetheless conveyed the profound challenge of representing a client who seemed unable to grasp the reality of her situation. There were moments during our strategy sessions when I genuinely couldn't tell if Sarah understood she was facing a murder trial rather than preparing for a broadcast segment, Blackwell revealed. She would focus intensely on how to position her body for maximum sympathetic impact from the jury, or which emotional register to use when speaking, but showed minimal interest in the actual evidence or legal arguments we needed to address. The anniversary coverage prompted renewed public fascination with Sarah Vallée, who remained incarcerated at Mountain View under restricted conditions following Anderson's recommendations. Despite the facility's enhanced monitoring, information about Sarah's prison life occasionally leaked through released inmates or corrections staff. According to these accounts, Sarah had adapted to her circumstances by creating what one former inmate described as her own little television studio within the confines of prison life. She had reportedly established regular programming where she would deliver news updates about prison events, conduct interview sessions with fellow inmates, and even create dramatized reenactments of their crimes presented in sympathetic framing, all without access to actual recording equipment, performing solely for the live audience of her incarcerated peers. While some mental health professionals suggested this behavior represented a harmless coping mechanism, others, including Dr. Natasha Reeves, viewed it as evidence of Sarah's continued dangerous disconnection from reality. "She's not playing at being a news anchor," Reeves explained in a professional journal article published 18 months after the murder. "She genuinely experiences herself as continuing her broadcasting career within the prison environment. This is not role-playing, but reality distortion, a fundamental inability to integrate her criminal actions and their consequences into a coherent, authentic identity." This assessment was supported by Sarah's continued reference to herself in the third person during psychological evaluations, discussing the Sarah Vallée case as if analyzing a story about someone else. 2 years into Sarah's life sentence, a new development brought the case back into public attention when a package of materials arrived at the offices of several true crime podcasts and media outlets. The package contained recordings, letters, and a manuscript titled Reframing Justice: How Media Narratives Fail Incarcerated Women, authored by Elizabeth Reed, the pseudonym Sarah had used for her short-lived prison podcast. Investigation revealed that Sarah had methodically dictated these materials during approved visits with a former production assistant who had remained loyal despite her conviction. The assistant had recorded Sarah's dictation using a smartwatch with audio capabilities, evading the prison's monitoring systems, and compiled the materials according to Sarah's detailed instructions. The manuscript and accompanying materials presented an alternative narrative of Sarah's case, one that portrayed Shannon Valle as a psychologically abusive stage mother who had controlled and exploited her daughter from adolescence, ultimately threatening to destroy Sarah's career out of jealousy and resentment. While incorporating factual elements established during the trial, Shannon's controlling behavior, her threats to expose Sarah's financial activities, and secret online content, the narrative carefully omitted the overwhelming physical evidence of Sarah's guilt while emphasizing procedural criticisms of the investigation. Most disturbingly, the manuscript included guidance for other incarcerated women on how to reframe their own violent crimes as acts of empowerment or necessary self-defense, regardless of the actual circumstances. This attempt to disseminate her alternative narrative from prison prompted a formal review of Sarah Valle's communications privileges and resulted in further restrictions. However, the manuscript had already been digitized and began circulating online, finding receptive audiences among certain corners of social media where users were predisposed to distrust official accounts and embrace counter-narratives. A dedicated online community formed around Sarah's case, with some members going so far as to organize protests outside the Travis County Courthouse on the anniversary of her sentencing. These developments concerned Anderson and others who had worked on the case, as they represented the real-world impact of narrative manipulation techniques refined through years of media practice and now weaponized to undermine factual reality. 3 years after Shannon Valle's murder, the case took another unexpected turn when Dr. Natasha Reeves published a comprehensive psychological profile of Sarah Valle in the Journal of Forensic Psychiatry, with all appropriate permissions and anonymization as required by ethical guidelines. The profile detailed what Reeves termed performance identity disorder, a proposed new classification for individuals whose performed public persona had so thoroughly subsumed their authentic identity that they became capable of compartmentalizing even the most extreme behaviors if they threatened the performed self. The paper used Sarah's case as its central example, describing how years of broadcasting had created a split between her authentic emotions and her performed presentation, eventually leading to a state where maintaining her public image took priority over fundamental moral boundaries, including the taboo against matricide. Reeves's paper sparked significant debate within psychiatric and legal communities, with some experts arguing that the proposed disorder simply described extreme narcissism or dissociative tendencies, while others recognized it as a meaningful framework for understanding a potentially growing category of offenders in an increasingly media-saturated society. The concept gained particular traction among law enforcement agencies dealing with crimes involving social media personalities, influencers, and others whose livelihood depended on maintaining carefully constructed public personas. Several police departments, including Austin's, incorporated Reeves's findings into training materials for detectives working cases involving individuals from media backgrounds. 4 years into her incarceration, Sarah Valle's prison behavior entered a new phase that both fascinated and concerned mental health professionals monitoring her case. According to staff reports, Sarah had begun broadcasting daily news programs from her cell to an imaginary audience, complete with detailed weather reports, breaking news updates about prison events, and interview segments with non-existent guests. Unlike her earlier prison performances, which had been directed at actual fellow inmates, these broadcasts occurred when Sarah was alone, suggesting a further retreat from consensual reality into a fully internalized performance world, where she continued her television career uninterrupted by the physical realities of incarceration. Dr. Reeves, who continued to evaluate Sarah quarterly despite having transferred to another facility, documented this progression with concern. She's no longer attempting to convince others of her alternative narrative. Reeves noted in a confidential assessment. She's now fully inhabiting a self-generated reality where her incarceration is either temporary or somehow part of her broadcasting career. When confronted with the contradiction between this belief and her life sentence, she responds with scripted phrases about pending appeals or new evidence that don't correspond to any actual legal proceedings in her case. This deepening detachment from reality prompted adjustments to Sarah's psychiatric treatment regimen, though medications produced limited improvement in her condition. 5 years after Shannon Vallee's murder, Detective David Anderson received an invitation to present the case at the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit as part of a symposium on emerging patterns in familial homicide. His presentation, titled "When Performance Consumes Reality, Media Psychology and Violent Crime," used the Vallee case to illustrate how individuals deeply embedded in performance-based careers might develop unique psychological profiles that traditional investigative approaches failed to fully address. "We're trained to look for signs of deception in suspects," Anderson explained to the assembled law enforcement professionals. "But what happens when the suspect has been professionally trained to present artificial emotions convincingly for years?" Sarah Vallee didn't display the normal markers of deception because, in a fundamental way, her entire presentation of self was a performance. There was no authentic baseline against which to measure deceptive behaviors. The symposium included a remote video interview with Dr. Reeves, who provided updates on Sarah's psychological condition after 5 years of incarceration and treatment. "The most concerning development," Reeves reported, "is that Sarah has now constructed an elaborate alternative explanation for her daily reality in the correctional facility. She describes her cell as a minimalist studio apartment she's chosen for a special, long-term investigative project on women's incarceration. When faced with unavoidable prison protocols, she incorporates them into this narrative, describing guards as production assistants and mandatory activities as scheduled appearances. This isn't typical denial or defensive psychological adaptation. It's a comprehensive alternative reality constructed using the narrative techniques she mastered in her broadcasting career. As the Vallee case receded from public attention, supplanted by newer crimes and media sensations, its legacy continued to influence both law enforcement practices and psychiatric understanding of how performance-based careers might affect psychological development in extreme cases. Police academies across Texas and eventually nationwide incorporated elements of the case into training modules on interviewing media-trained suspects, while forensic psychology programs used the recorded interrogation videos to demonstrate how traditional deception detection methods might fail when confronting individuals whose professional identity was built on controlled emotional presentation. Sarah Vallee herself, once a familiar presence in Austin living rooms delivering the evening news, became instead a case study in the potential dangers of allowing a performed identity to completely subsume authentic human connection. 6 years after Shannon Vallee's murder, Anderson made one final visit to Mountain View to observe Sarah Vallee as part of a follow-up study on high-profile inmates with psychological conditions requiring specialized management protocols. What he witnessed both confirmed and complicated the conclusions he had drawn from the investigation and subsequent developments. Sarah, now 40 years old and showing visible signs of aging without access to the cosmetic procedures that had once preoccupied her, sat across from him in the visitation room with the same perfect posture and camera-ready smile she had displayed during her broadcasts, her interrogation, and her trial. She greeted him warmly, as if welcoming a returning guest to her show, rather than acknowledging the detective who had built the case that resulted in her life sentence. "Detective Anderson," she said in the intimate, engaging tone that had once been her professional trademark, "how wonderful to see you again. I've been meaning to invite you for a follow-up segment. Viewers are always interested in where key figures from past stories end up. This opening, treating their meeting as a broadcast interview rather than a correctional facility visit, demonstrated the profound persistence of her performance orientation despite years of incarceration and psychiatric treatment. Throughout their conversation, Sarah seamlessly incorporated prison realities into her broadcast narrative framework, referring to her cell as her home studio, describing other inmates as production team members, and characterizing prison restrictions as creative challenges in the current production environment. What struck Anderson most forcefully during this final encounter was not just Sarah's continued detachment from reality, but how her broadcast persona, once a professional skill set she could presumably activate and deactivate at will, had become her only mode of existence. There were no moments of authentic connection, no breaks in the performance, no recognition of the fundamental reality that she had murdered her mother and would spend the remainder of her life in prison as consequence. Even when directly confronted with these facts, she responded with the practiced empathetic expressions and carefully modulated voice she had used when reporting on tragedies affecting others, creating emotional distance through professional technique even from her own life circumstances. As Anderson prepared to leave, Sarah offered what she clearly intended as a profound insight into her situation, delivered with the serious, thoughtful expression she had used for her news program's closing commentary segments. You know, Detective, in broadcast journalism we learn that every story has multiple perspectives, multiple truths, depending on the framing. The tragedy in my situation isn't just what happened to my mother, it's how a single narrative was allowed to define a complex human situation. This statement, positioning her conviction for matricide as simply one possible framing among many equally valid alternatives, encapsulated the moral and cognitive disconnection that had enabled her crime and continued to prevent authentic reckoning with its consequences. Walking out of Mountain View for the final time, Anderson reflected on the profound implications of the Saravalli case for understanding the intersection of media psychology and criminal behavior. In his final report, he would write, "What makes the Valli case significant beyond its sensational elements is how it demonstrates the potential consequences when performance consumes reality, when the ability to present convincing simulations of human emotion eventually hollows out authentic emotional experience itself." Saravalli didn't simply murder her mother and then lie about it. She committed matricide and then incorporated this act into her performed reality in the same way she had processed countless other stories during her broadcasting career, with the same emotional distance, the same focus on presentation rather than substance, the same fundamental disconnection between action and authentic consequence. 7 years after Shannon Valle's murder, Sarah remains at Mountain View, continuing to broadcast to imaginary audiences from her cell, maintaining her performance identity despite the absence of cameras or viewers. The emerald green trench coat that helped connect her to the crime scene remains in evidence storage at the Travis County Courthouse, a tangible reminder of the case that forced law enforcement, mental health professionals, and the public to reconsider conventional understanding of criminal psychology in an increasingly performance-oriented media culture, and in classrooms, training facilities, and professional conferences across the country. The story of the news anchor who smiled at the camera during her murder trial continues to serve as a cautionary example of what can happen when the line between reporting reality and creating it becomes fatally blurred in a mind trained to prioritize performance above all else, even the most fundamental human bonds.